Hello and bienvenido, San Antonio. Welcome to the Alamo Hour, discussing the people, places, and passion that make our city. My name is Justin Hill, a local attorney, a proud San Antonioan, and keeper of chickens and bees. On the Alamo Hour, you'll get to hear from the people that make San Antonio great and unique and the best kept secret in Texas. We're glad that you're here. All right, welcome to the Alamo Hour. Today's guest is Dr. Carey Latimore. Dr. Latimore is a professor of African American Studies and other classes at Trinity University. He got his PhD from Emory. He's written extensively. He's won many awards. He was recently tapped by the city to share some of his thoughts and some of his research regarding the Alamo Plaza project and some decisions on what to do with some of the surrounding buildings. We've asked Dr. Latimore to be on here. We asked previously to all of the protests in the city and some of the issues that have arisen since then, but the timing couldn't be better. So thank you, Dr. Latimore, for being here today.
Thank you, Justin. It's my honor to be here.
We had a fantastic conversation before we got to start recording, which we should have recorded, but we'll probably recover some of that. But
and long time ago too. We talked about a month or so ago.
Yeah, for about an hour.
Yeah,
it was a great conversation.
And all this other stuff.
We were introduced through Dr. Lesh, who was your best man in your wedding, and is a friend of the show. He's probably, I'm not going to kid, he's probably the biggest supporter of what I'm doing here, and I can't thank him enough.
David's a good man.
Yeah, he is.
I'm sure he's listening to that too.
He will be listening. So it's funny. Dr. Lesh will give me opinions and what to ask, and I think with you, he was like, "Well, ask him how we met," or I can't remember what it was, but he has to be part of everything. You've listened to some of the shows. Every show we start with a top 10. I've read some interviews you've done with the newspaper. I've read some interviews you've done with Trinity's Getting to Know a Professor. Basically anything I could find, I've read. I've watched some videos. I found a few things I want to talk about. Well, the internet has a lot of things out there. Compared to some people, you're fine. You don't have anything that there's really not a ton out there. You good. Academics, y'all's research is in books that cost $250 a piece. So I don't, I tried to buy a Lesh book and I don't get the Lesh special, even though I know him. So I had to pay. I only bought the one that was $9. I'm not going to lie. I wouldn't buy any of his other books. Were you at his book?
I was not. I had a class that night.
It was interesting. It was like a book release party for 2 books at once or something.
Well, that's how Lesh rolls.
He did a reading of his book, and it was hard to take it seriously, honestly, because I know Lesh socially. I don't know him as an academic. So I didn't realize how austere and dry those events were.
Well, Lesh has a very powerful presence, too.
He does?
In the classroom, he is extraordinarily, and I'm not saying anything that he wouldn't agree with, he has an extraordinary presence.
Yeah, I believe that.
And so there are some students who are afraid of him.
I believe that.
And, of course, then he's very tall, and he's got that baseball background.
Yeah.
And so people are not used to having their college professor being a former baseball player.
Yeah.
And drafted, I think, in the first round or something like that. I mean, he's a
real deal.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing that is always fun with hanging out with him, because me and our mutual friend Tim, we just see him as our friend, so we don't give him any extra deference. And, that's hard for him to take for the first, 20 minutes. All right, so top 10, we're going to get through some stuff. Then we're going to spend some time talking about your areas of research. I want to talk to you about your teaching philosophy. I think that's interesting. I went to law school at Baylor, which still employs the paper chase style Socratic method. And you're up on your feet, it's in your face, and if you don't know, you get kicked out of class. I mean, it was a very intense environment. So let's start with when and why did you move to San Antonio?
Trinity University was the when and the why. I did not know a lot about Trinity before I came here, but when I was at Emory University finishing up my PhD, one of the things that happens in academia is you have these hiring cycles. And so it's really a year-long process that begins really at the end of the summer. And so all of these universities really post their jobs, at least for history, probably around August or September. And so there are a couple of different places where we find out who's interested in hiring somebody. And so I looked at these places, and Trinity University was looking for a historian in my area. And so it was one of the 6 or 7 universities that I applied to. And so that happened. And then around October, I think the search, theoretically, the application period ended. And in December, they contacted me saying that they were interested in having a future conversation with me at the American Historical Association meeting, which is all academic fields have these huge meetings.
Okay.
And there are thousands of people that will go. And for the AHA, it's usually in a very cold environment. And when I say cold, I mean they're going to meet in Chicago, they're going to meet in New York, they're going to meet in D.C., and it's going to be the first week of January. So you know it's going to be cold. And so you're bringing all these people to D.C. or somewhere, some cold environment, and all of these people are looking for jobs, in addition to other things that they do at the regular meeting. I was just a young kid. I'd never done a job interview before. So I knew that there were probably about 10 other people that were interviewing for that same position, or 12. They bring you up for a half-hour long meeting, and there was a table of about 7 faculty members at Trinity there, and I was this one guy surrounded by these faculty members. Talk about a power dynamic there, and I'm sitting there trying to answer questions right. And I was so young, I probably didn't even think about it at that time. And so they interviewed me. Then I got called back to a second interview the next day. They said, we'd like to talk to you again. I'm like, gosh, I guess I'm doing a good job. Yeah. And so I came back. They talked to me for about another 45 minutes to an hour. And then they said, well, you'll hear from us at some point in time. And so then in January, a couple weeks later, I received a call saying, we'd like you to come to San Antonio and talk to us a little bit more. So got on a plane, came to San Antonio, and over a 2-day period, they took me around the university. They talked to me. I had to present my research and other kinds of things. Then I went home. They said, well, we'll talk to you later. And so I get a call probably 3 weeks later, offering me the job.
What a process.
So it's a long, huge process. It's not just you go and you find it the next day. Everything in academia is long, drawn out. Getting a PhD is 6 or 7 years. It's long, drawn out. Yeah. Getting tenure is long and drawn out. So we make things seem much longer than they actually need to be, but that's how I ended up in Texas.
What year was that?
That was in 2004 when I started.
All right.
And Trinity is very similar to my undergrad, the University of Richmond. Small liberal arts, really pays attention to teaching. They care about research. A great university and a great city. Yeah. You know, Richmond is obviously different from San Antonio, but in many ways, Texas and Virginia share some commonalities. Sure. Both states kind of think that they are the state. We in Virginia.
I didn't know Virginia had that chip on its shoulder.
The Commonwealth of Virginia. When you were in Virginia, we have the most presidents from our state. You know, the history of our state. I mean, when you take Virginia history in 4th grade, it is hammered into you the prominence.
They don't have the Alamo, though.
Of Virginia. They don't have the Alamo. But, you know, we do have aspects of history, the Confederacy, and, you know, the end of the Revolutionary War was in, you know, so you got Cornwallis's Cave and Colonial Williamsburg and all of these different aspects of Virginia. And I think there's a bit of arrogance to Virginians about who they are. And the same thing about Texans. I mean, in Virginia, the biggest thing that people want to be is an FFV, which is the first family of Virginia.
Oh, geez.
And it's almost like, I guess, the daughters of the Alamo, or the people trace their history back to
people that were at the Alamo.
Exactly, people who were at the Alamo or these other families and major land grant families. And so these two states share some things in common. And so Trinity was in a place that was a really good place at that time, and still is, very similar to where I felt my university was when I started as an undergrad at the University of Richmond. So it was kind of like going home in a sense. And San Antonio is a really cool city.
I love it.
Think about it.
Yeah.
And so Trinity was my first choice of universities, and I got my first choice. And so I guess the rest is the rest.
So I don't want you to get into it because I don't think I want to know. But what is the title of your dissertation? I always think those are fun to hear.
Always a Minority. Antebellum Free Blacks in the Civil War era. I think that was what the title.
Okay, that's pretty normal. I mean, you hear some that are just off the wall.
Well, always is a minority. Always a minority. Then you have the colon.
Sure.
And then the rest of it. You know, every dissertation topic is going to have the little cool thing, and then the explanation after the colon.
But you know what I'm talking about. Some are just absurd. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And some of them are. Mine was only like 200 pages.
Oh.
Some of them are much.
How many footnotes?
Hundreds.
Okay.
Because you have to.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. What are your main sources of news?
Lots of different things.
I've started asking this because news has become such a hot topic.
This is going to sound cliche, but CNN is a source for me. I mean, I always go through CNN. And then I do in an odd way, I do searches.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in different subjects, and so I do subject searches and find what's there and look at the kind of, maybe the historian in me looks at the provenance and where the different, where's that source coming from.
Yeah.
And obviously I'm looking at MSNBC. I'll even check out Fox.
Yeah.
For me, as many sources as I can get, that's what interests me.
That's my take on it.
Of course, the Express
Yeah.
News, and of course the Rivard, all those different.
So Rivard was very clear to tell me that he reads the Express, SanAntonioExpress.com or ExpressNews.com, but not MySA.com. I didn't realize those were so, independent of one another.
Yeah, I never thought about that.
Yeah, I didn't either. No,
I'm just finding the news because I guess because of what I do and doing social history, African American social history, you're finding whatever you can. And so there's not like this, it's not always a treasure trove of research for you.
Yeah.
And so you're getting pieces and shards and a bit here and a bit there, and you bring it together and then you evaluate it. And I think that's prepared me for the kind of society that we live in now, in which you don't always know the validity of a source unless if you test it.
Right.
And that's something that I try to do with my students, is trying to help them move through the process of how do you evaluate sources. And one of the ways of doing it is you kind of find out where things are coming from. You look at it comparing to other things, who's writing something. And I think it's kind of the same thing that we have to do when we look at news today, because there's a lot of news out there.
And there's so much that's not news
there
that calls itself news.
Exactly.
All right. Hidden gems in San Antonio. We do this with everybody. For me, things like the tea garden, the further out missions, those are some things when I first moved here, I didn't know they existed. And I think, if you're coming to San Antonio, you got to go away from that and go check out some of these things. Do you have any hidden gems in San Antonio you recommend?
Susie's Lumpia House.
I've never even heard of this.
It's a Filipino restaurant in Culebra. Is it still open? I think, with COVID, I always have to ask because I haven't, you never know.
You reached around and asked your wife, just so people,
my wife, who's Filipino.
So you don't look crazy asking the wall or something.
I'm always asking. My students think I'm doing that, but I'm.
Susie's Lumpia House.
Yes, it's on Culebra Road.
Is that Lumpia?
Yes.
Okay.
An amazing Filipino restaurant. On Saturdays, they typically offer buffet, which I don't know how that's working with COVID these days, but they have a great, they have some great
go-to dish.
Chicken adobo.
Adobo?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
ADOBO.
Anything else?
They have these great shrimp, but I don't, there's a word that they call it, but I can't think, just whatever, their shrimp. Just go for their shrimp. It's really good.
All right. I've never eaten Filipino food in San Antonio.
And the pork adobo is good too if you like pork. I'm not a big pork
Adobo's
eater.
the sauce, I assume?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's kind of a vinegary, at this place it's more of a vinegary type salt base.
All right. Kind of like the barbecue you're used to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. In Virginia, we do vinegar is a very, which I guess is why Susie's it reminds me of certain Virginia things.
Sure.
Now, some Filipino restaurants are a little more sweet-based than the vinegar-based, depending on the island that they're from. But these people are actually from the island of Samar, which is a more centrally located island.
Is there 100 islands in the Philippines? There's tons of them,
thousands.
right? Okay, all right.
Thousands.
Inhabited 100?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And hundreds of languages as well.
Oh, wow.
Each one of those islands often has their own language. And I call it a language because sometimes we classify something as a dialect and it's really a language, but a dialect almost makes it sound like it's not real and legitimate.
Sure.
Versus a language when we say that that's something that's different and distinct.
Yeah.
I may have a Southern dialect, but it's an English language.
Right.
These are real languages that are distinct.
Okay. What are you teaching currently?
Currently, I'm on leave.
Okay. What was the last classes you taught?
This semester that just ended, I taught the African American experience since Reconstruction, and I also taught a course on the Old South, which looks at Southern politics, race, economics, really from the beginning. And when I say the beginning, looking at a little bit of the indigenous population in the South in the early period on up through colonization, through the Civil War.
Does the South cover Texas in your class?
It does.
Okay. Do you consider Texas to be part of the South?
I do.
All of it, or kind of the dividing line?
It's hard to cut up a state, but I do think that West Texas is not really Southern.
It's more the Southwest.
It's the Southwest.
And East Texas is more the South.
East Texas, you've got cotton. Although you do have slavery in San Antonio, and you do have, you have out in Wilson County and Seguin and all those, these are pockets there, but there's a different feel in the southwestern Texas than there is in eastern Texas, which is very, where you have strong cotton-based stuff. And, as you move out from there to Dallas and you see the migrations, African Americans after the Civil War certainly migrating in this area. Although there's some stuff happening here, this is a South and West city. But Texas, it is part of the Confederacy. And so it's an interesting state.
Yeah, it's debated a lot. It's discussed a lot.
Yeah.
Whether we were really part of the South.
The question of this whole class is really, is there a South?
Okay.
And I think that there is, but it doesn't start as. And so throughout the class, I asked them questions of, is it a South now? Is it a South now? And so as we move through the timeline, I think the students start to see, now things are starting to develop agriculturally, politically, socially. There's something that's linking these people, because there must be something that's linking people, obviously slavery, but there must be something that brings people to secede from something else.
Right.
There must be something to secede from. And there must be something where this other group is pulling themselves further away. And so as the two sides of this coin are pulling away, what's coalescing around to create something that can be identified when we think South?
Yeah. Slavery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when people say that the Civil War has nothing to do with slavery, I'm like, oh, really?
Who says that?
There were some, there are some people. I mean, growing up where I did, there were a lot of people who would say that
you hear it on the news still.
Had everything about taxes and Lincoln and
states' rights.
States' rights. Yeah, and then you read the Cornerstone speech, and then you look at, the Confederate Constitution, and then you think about how the South felt for such a long period of time that people were trying to push in on them. You read Calhoun's speeches that he was giving about, slavery, a positive good is what John C. Calhoun says, and that if we don't stop this whole seed of abolitionism is going to really infringe upon us.
I had no idea how much money those cotton plantations made in today's dollars. I was reading an article and it said by today's dollars, I want to say it was something like $80 million a year is what a moderately successful cotton plantation was doing back then. And you start seeing how those families that have the political power are looking at giving up $80 million a year. Obviously it had to do with slavery. I just didn't realize the dollar figures involved. Slavery
is a social system, but it's also an economic system.
Sure.
And when you start to think about, when you go through census records, and the census records of that period, each of those 10 years, they're going to show real property and personal property. And the slaves are listed in the real property. And so they are real assets.
Yeah.
If a person dies and their assets have to be divided, as a lawyer, that includes slaves. So these aren't by law people, theoretically. These are things. And so even if you wanted to free a slave, you may not be able to do it if you have debts. And so all of it's tied into this. Not to say that many people wanted to do that and got caught up by debt, but it is their money. It is their source. And it's where, for many of these slave masters, where so much of their money is tied into. Slaves are more valuable than land, in a sense.
Yeah.
Now, you have lots of land that has large value, but those slaves have even more value per person.
Sure.
Think of per acre. Per acre is cheap, but per slave, that's a different story. So, yeah. And even over the last 30 to 40 years of the antebellum period, the number of slave owners gets smaller, but the percentage of the number of slaves that they own gets larger. And so the wealthy slaveholders get more wealthy.
Just like anything else, things start to centralize.
Yes. Yeah. We talked about income inequality. Slavery was a period in time of severe income inequality.
Yeah, it is better. Okay, we're going to get in. Well, every one of these is so great that this is why I like it, because I could get into these rabbit trails for a long time. And I think I'm going to go audit your class one day, if that's okay.
Come on in.
Les just told me I can, but I think he would, if you listened to his episode, he has a problem giggling when he's around me. So did you listen to it?
I did not.
You should
I will
listen to it. I mean, he gets
Lesh giggle.
He gets the giggles for a solid 10 minutes. I mean,
Lesh.
You should watch the YouTube video is what you should watch because he's on there giggling. Yes.
Lesh.
Yes. We have a different kind of friendship. Do you have any hobbies outside of your academic work?
Well, I like computer apps. I like my phone apps.
Okay.
So right now I am playing, let's see here. What do I have on my
Panda
cell?
Pop?
No.
Snood?
Madden NFL and RBI 20 are the two that I'm working on.
I didn't know they had those games on there.
Yeah.
Do you ever do Lumosity, the brain trainer?
No, I do.
I like it.
I like things that don't make me think on
Okay.
on
Yeah, sometimes it gives me a headache.
Yeah, I do. You know, when I come home from teaching and researching, I want to play something like an old video game. I was an old Nintendo, Atari. You know, I started with Atari 2600 or 2700. Then I went to Nintendo 16-bit after that. That was Super Nintendo. I did all of the video games.
I had the Sega Master System.
I had Sega Genesis.
So that was after. So the first one was a Sega Master System that had a cartridge option, but also a card option. So then I went into the Genesis.
So I was a game person.
Okay.
I remember that was probably, in addition to being a truck driver.
We're going to get there.
What I really wanted to do was also to work with Nintendo Power. It was a magazine back in the day.
I remember.
And
real thick magazine.
Yeah, it was a real thick magazine. And I always thought that I wanted to be one of these gaming people.
So did you love the movie with Fred Savage, The Wizard? Do you remember?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he gave us the secret way to get up in the dungeon and find the...
I wanted to be a gamer.
Yeah.
But it didn't quite end up that way.
I love the idea that playing on your phone is a hobby. So I'm going to use that in life. I'm not messing on my phone. This is a hobby. I'm going to go with that.
I see it as a hobby. Now, my wife loves gardening, and every now and then I help her out there. But I really see the games as like
I'm with you. Yeah. Okay, so this is probably the most important question of your top 10, and then we're going to speed through these so we can get into the meat. You put in one of the articles I read that preparing for class, you like to listen to music, but also preparing for class, you listen to music. R&B is one of the areas, I don't know enough, not going to get in there, but 80s, 90s rap was something you listed. Who are your 80s, 90s rap groups that you still go back to?
You know, LL Cool J.
Okay, all right.
And, you know, people think that he's, you know, not as hard-hitting as some of the others, but some of the earliest rappers that I remember were probably Houdini, which comes out in about 84, 83, 84. So this is kind of the beginning. Then you had Grandmaster Flash.
Okay.
Did a song called The Message, which I really go back to now and even use in my course. But they weren't cool as LL Cool J was when he came up with Mama Said Knock You Out. And then you had the MTV Unplugged thing. But LL Cool J for me just seemed hard at that point in time when I was probably a 14-year-old young
What
man.
year would that song have
Mama
come out?
Said Knock You Out, I think, was 89.
Okay.
Don't hold me to it, but I think it was 1989 or 90, somewhere in there. And music in that time period is changing as kind of what we refer to as New Jack Swing.
Yeah.
And so with Keith Sweat, Bobby Brown, you get a more hard-edged sound music that's kind of...
That's more R&B though, right?
It is R&B, but it's linked with hip-hop. And so the sounds are much more hard-hitting than, say, the sounds of a Freddie Jackson or a Luther Vandross or a Whitney Houston, which is much more pop-centered.
Yeah.
And so that later 80s through probably 95 or whatever, that's the period of time which I'm listening to. And so LL Cool J is there. I was into Public Enemy.
Okay.
When, you know, I was there.
So I kind of had a running list before you got here of what I thought you were going to say. LL Cool J was not on the list.
I was into Tupac.
Okay.
Of course, MC Hammer was around.
I had that on the list.
But it was really LL Cool J for me. I'm not going to lie. This probably will get me in trouble, but I also listened to Two Live Crew.
Okay.
At that time.
NWA?
NWA, of course.
All right.
My mother was the one who bought the Two Live Crew.
Nice. Way to go, Mom.
Well, she had to because I was too young, and as nasty as they want to be, that had the parental advisory, so they would not allow me to purchase it. So I told my mother, I really want to listen to this, and she was like, okay, we're going to listen to this. And then she said, but if I buy this for you, we have to listen to it together. And so we had this cassette tape, and because it's a cassette tape at that time, and so We were in Newport News, which was about 50 miles from where I grew up, because I grew up in a rural area. There was no radio, no place to buy any CDs or cassettes there. So I had to go to Newport News, a big city, right? And so I had to listen to As Nasty as They Want to Be with my mother alone on a 50-mile return trip. And I could just see my mother driving and shaking as she was listening to the lyrics. And so we drive into the yard, and I'm like, she looks at me and I look at her, and we don't quite know what to say to each other. And I said, what did you think about that, Mama? And I just heard a silence. And she said, well, it had a good beat. But let's talk about the rest of it. So, the misogyny and everything.
So did she let you keep the album at that?
She did.
All right.
My mother's a music teacher. So
okay.
She never believed in censoring anything.
Good for her.
And that was important to her, but she saw it as a teachable moment.
Yeah.
And so she pointed out to me the things in it that she did not agree with and that she would hope that I would not repeat.
Yeah.
But she also said that it was a perspective that I needed to understand.
Good. Good for her. My parents let me listen to and watch everything, and I'm still just, I'm ravenous with movies and music because they let me do it.
Now, my father never said anything about it. He never listened to it.
He probably wouldn't have liked it.
Probably not.
Okay. We've gone through, we're going to lightning round here real quick. Do you have a favorite fiesta event?
Taste of New Orleans.
Okay. I haven't been in a few years.
It's been a couple years, but that's my favorite.
And what on earth is it about being a truck driver that was your listed chosen occupation if you were not a professor? And have you watched Over the Top, the movie?
I did.
Okay.
But that wasn't the movie that did it for me. It goes back a few years, Smokey and the Bandit.
All right.
And because my father, in addition to being a magistrate, was also a fiberglass boat repairman. And so we had a lot of trucks that would come in and be repaired. And so you'd have these big trucks, these tractor trailers, and I would go into the tractor trailer and look around and, kind of like play with the thing. And if we were moving them around, my father would move it around and I would be in the tractor, on the tractor trailer. And so I think that growing up in that environment, and my county's name was Middlesex, and we would kind of say it was in the middle of nowhere. To get to a mall, it was over 50 miles. To get to, say, a McDonald's, it was 25 miles. A bowling alley was 20. Basically, there was nothing there growing up. And so I always envisioned the truckers as the people who got to see the world. Yeah. And that they would be on their CBs and they would talk. And I guess I always dreamed about meeting different kinds of people and going somewhere. And just the thought of just riding around the country. It was exciting to me. And then Smokey and the Bandit, which, for all of its problems, everybody was watching when I was young. And you just think of taking beer across the state lines or whatever they were doing in the first one. And, I love Trans Am. I wanted a Trans Am when I was a kid. I wanted those kinds of things. And to drive a truck was just the kind of lifestyle that I wanted to live.
There is that romanticism to it. But you also put in your interview that it was the open road, See America, CBs, but you also put truck stops. Have you been to a truck stop lately? There's very little romantic about a truck stop.
But it's not like that. You don't see that in the...
Not in the movies.
You don't see that in the movies. And, I think when you grow up in a place of where people would hang out at a local fish market, and that's what you would do on Saturday nights or Friday nights, or you would just go 50 miles, just going somewhere. And I think most of us had a dream of just going somewhere. Yeah. Not that we hated where we grew up, but we knew that there had to be something else out there, and we wanted to seek it. And, most of the people never really got out. Like my father, he went to, he was in Korea. My mother came from another area, but so many people never got outside of the 3 or 4 county area. And so we kind of dreamed about that.
Yeah. I think a lot of kids have those dreams. Yeah. I mean, I grew up in a small town, and luckily I got out, but a lot of people don't.
And it was also a simple, when you think about it, it was a life available that was achievable. And so people where I grew up, fish, many jobs were like fishing, oystering. Truck driver was a step above that in a sense, farming. Those are very hard fields to enter, especially in the time period that I was growing up.
Right.
Our parents or grandparents, it was much easier to be a farmer then because you didn't have to have huge swaths of land.
Right.
And so farming became much more mechanized. It became much more bigger. You had to have larger pieces of land. And so the people were able to do it. They had their own land, but they rented numerous other lots.
Right.
And putting them together. And it was a very expensive thing. You can drive a truck.
Yeah.
And
make your own
get
hours.
Good insurance.
Yeah.
Make your own hours. Meet different people. Talk on CBs, which I thought was cool right there. I mean, we had a CB when I was growing up. My parents had, some of the cars that we had CBs, and so I just loved working on the CB.
My uncle had one, and I thought it was so cool.
Yeah.
If you could ever get him to respond to you, that was super cool. Yeah.
Exactly. And still, when I see a tractor trailer, I love it.
Yeah.
It's just something about it. When I see them riding down, I love pulling next to them. And
it's the things that we loved as kids we still kind of love. Yeah. Okay, well, I want to change gears, and I want to talk to you about some different things. You and I had a long conversation prior to really all of this happening in the news, generally about what I wanted to talk about, your areas of expertise. And really at that time, I wanted to have you on and just have a discussion about San Antonio's sort of racial disparity or racial justice history to the extent you know it, and just have a discussion because I don't think it gets talked about much in terms of San Antonio. You hear about it in terms of other cities. In the meantime, we had the George Floyd incident, and San Antonio now has sort of a nonstop protest going on. And I'm not going to, Mr. Rivard, correct me when I said riots. We really haven't had riots. Yeah. We had some windows broken and things like that. But San Antonio, for the most part, we treat people with respect, and we do our best to keep our city nice. I want to talk to you about a few things that I have sort of noticed. I want you to correct me where I'm wrong, if and where I am wrong. One of the things that sort of I have noticed just generally with what is going on seems to be kind of the lack of clear messaging from protesters and from people in affected communities. Have you seen or do you see sort of a lack of clear messaging, and what do you think should be the purpose of this moment and opportunity in America?
I think there is a message kind of crystallizing, but I do think that there are different sides that have different interests and perspectives. I think there is a side of where maybe I think the majority lie, and that's in what happened with George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and all these other issues are just horrible.
Yeah. And
as a nation, we need to come together to do something about that, and that includes the area of policing. And how do we get a hold of what's happening, and then perhaps maybe trying to understand what black men feel in that type of environment. And I'll talk about that as an African-American man. I think there are some others who are talking now defunding the police and other kinds of issues. I'm not on that side, but I am on the side of accountability for police.
Right.
And I think that there are some things that we can do as a city. Of course, we have a police contract, and we have to uphold that contract. And so I think we all have to recognize that, we're a society of laws and contracts, and we have to fulfill those things. But then maybe at that next contract thing, there are things that could be done. And I would think that the police would want to do that to be accountable. There are some who would say police, the question is, how do we make them accountable in a fair way as well? I don't necessarily support initiatives that say that the community will assess cops. I mean, I'm uncomfortable with that with my own understanding of assessment in academia.
Right.
Student evaluations.
Sure.
They aren't always, there are lots of things that go into those evaluations. So if we do that, we have to make sure that it's fair as well. Now, I think that there is a side of more of the protesters, and I would say, even beyond that, another group that goes beyond the protesters that perhaps really want a complete transformation of American society.
Right.
So I think that there are these two competing issues, or three or four, many different ones. And I think the interesting part will be figuring out how, I think there's a coalition growing around policing. I think there's a coalition growing around the larger issues, which are income inequality, and that I'm glad to see that we're now just not talking about income inequality in the abstract, but specifically looking at the fact that the black household basically is going to have white wealth is going to be probably about 10 times more than black wealth in this time. And there are historical reasons why that exists. And there's a reason why it exists here in San Antonio. I think those are issues that maybe this is the point in time in which we can start to look at it and maybe look at ways of alleviating those issues. Those are hard issues.
Very hard.
And then there are other people who are talking about reparations. And I won't go into reparations, but there are other people who believe that that's a way of addressing historical inequities. And so there's a lot of things going on because America's interaction and race in America is so broad and so vast. It's not a one-stop shop. It's not a simple answer. It's pervasive. I mean, I think if you really don't have race, you probably really don't even have America.
Right.
And the reason why I say that is our founders talked about basically being enslaved, and they saw themselves almost as the slaves of the British. Well, that's kind of when you think about what they saw, they would look out from their plantations and see people who are not free, and then they come and write documents that talk about freedom. And so it's, I think, part of our DNA, whether we have ancestors who were slave owners or not, I think it's kind of tied into the American DNA. 13th, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendments that we all rely on really are about race. They are. And so you look at so much, even women's rights was, the fight over that dealt with race too.
Right.
So you can't disentangle just police violence from the broader issue. And I think that that's why it probably seems lots of different issues, because it's too much to attack. And
that's sort of my question. Well, first of all, I want to point out there's one of the articles where you talk about how your personal story includes ancestors who were slaves as well as ancestors who were slave owners, which I think people that go back far enough in America probably find that within their DNA. So you have a different perspective. One of the things that I'm concerned about during these protests is the opportunity may be lost because there is this scattershot approach. And I talk about it in terms of if you go onto YouTube and you just play a speech by Bill Clinton, and you let it play, it takes more extreme videos every time. They've done studies. So you end up in these communist videos if you do it. And my concern is sort of the defund the police, if I followed it correctly, kind of came from the demilitarize the police, which I think there's a lot to be said about how we have structured our police departments like a military. But then it becomes defund, then it becomes abolish, then it becomes some other thing. What my question for you is, it seems there's a lack of leadership in the movement. And just personally, I don't think Al Sharpton's doing anybody favors by hopping up and being kind of the voice of this movement. He has his own scandals and own history.
And Brawley being one of them. Yeah,
and being an informant to the FBI. I mean, he's got this long history of just being in the news because he seems to want to be in the news. Do you think there's a lack of leadership, and how do you think this movement, because I don't want to say it's community, I think there's a lot of all races and backgrounds that want to see some change here, but I think the movement lacks a clear voice. Have you noticed that? Do you think there is a clear voice that's going to come out that I maybe am just not grabbing in my own mind, or what do you think the problem is there?
It's a deep question. I'm going to try to get to all of the different parts. I think there's a way in which the media has acted in this, in which historically, when we look at how the media acts, it tries to anoint a black leader. And so we don't say, who's the white leader among white people?
Right.
Or the Latino leader. But for the last 150 years, we've anointed, sometimes people outside of the African-American community, anointed a person to be the spokesperson. And I don't know if that's necessarily healthy, because then it allows individual egos and other kinds of things to kind of dictate the direction of the movement.
And drown out the movement.
And perhaps drown out the movement. I think that there is a coalition developing that's a very exciting coalition that includes black, brown, white, all people around a certain number of core issues. Again, the police, what does it feel, the wealth gap. I think those are issues that I think have broad-based support and should be pursued. I think the other issues of defunding, demilitarization, those other things, those are issues that don't bring people together at this point. I think you should work on the things that you can actually accomplish.
Yeah.
I come from the late 80s and early 90s, and I do remember the issues with policing in the late early and 90s, and it's not just a drug issue. The drug was a part of the problem, but a lot of part of the problem was a lack of funding in police, among police, and that because of that, you had a lot of rogue cops.
Right.
And, if you look at New Orleans, you look at D.C., there were cops who were basically on the streets selling drugs. Not to say that doesn't, but that was kind of, when you're paying cops so little. And so when I hear these kinds of things, you have to convince me that you won't affect their ability to handle the job that they've been allowed to do.
Right.
Now, the way that we criminalize certain areas, we can take a look at that. So I think that there's some growing consensus that we don't necessarily rehabilitate in our nation. We criminalize. And so I think that those are issues that have broader support than just hacking up everything and creating something anew.
Sure.
I don't think, for me, I believe that you must try to build a consensus. That's the only way that you can actually enact real change. Blowing something up doesn't necessarily, you don't build a consensus over it. The consensus then moves to the other side.
Do you think there's
lose the people on the edges?
Do you think there is a risk, though, with the way police departments have become sort of, when I say militarized, I mean the access to armored vehicles, not just the SWAT, the access to tactical gear like their special forces in the military. I remember watching some of those riots in Ferguson and thinking, that looks like a war zone. That doesn't look like a police enforcement. And it's sort of the Stanford prison experiment. If you put people in that position, they, either consciously or not, take on a different role. Do you not think that is potentially a problem with taking away policing and turning it to almost a military action?
I think since the drug, since I would say the crack wars, you had this increasing militarization of the police. So even in cities like Los Angeles, you had police just knocking down buildings with tanks, basically. I'm like, dang, we're fighting wars that don't have the kind of equipment that we're using. And in that sense, when you have that kind of equipment, you are defining the other person as an enemy, and then you can do with them whatever you want to do with them. So certainly the way that we do police work should be taken a look at. And maybe I don't have a problem of, to disband police or disband that and whatever that means. I don't go in that direction, but certainly looking at how we perceive policing,
right?
What we perceive as defending people, and we need people to defend. If somebody's at my door, you want to be able to call a cop, or police. You don't want to hear, well, we're having a high activity night or something like that. But we also don't want to see a scenario in which it's been amped up to the point of where we feel like we have to go to war. When
I was a kid, I remember SWAT. Wow, SWAT. They were like the special forces. And then it just seemed that a lot more of them looked like SWAT, and a lot more of them had the equipment that SWAT had. And all of a sudden, the guy walking around with a billy club was all of a sudden in full tactical gear. And I'm definitely not for defunding or, doing away with police departments either, but it seems to be there has to be some return to neighborhood policing on top. And honestly, I'm not saying that about San Antonio, but just generally, you're seeing this problem in cities, especially some cities that have kind of militarized the police departments.
And there has to be accountability too.
Yeah.
I mean, in any, we can certainly pull the police out and say that they have an accountability problem, but America, in a sense, has an accountability problem. And in the world, when you have people put into positions where they're not held accountable by some standard, you got problems. The Catholic Church has problems because of a lack of accountability. And it's not just the Catholic Church, by the way. You have plenty evangelical churches that have people in positions of power that have placed themselves in a position where they will never be held accountable, and they do whatever they want to do because for some people, having power leads them to destructive behavior.
Right. I think within the context of San Antonio, this would be a good way to...
professors.
Yeah. I mean, it happens at all institutions, and then especially when you have an institutional mindset about it. From a San Antonio perspective, I think accountability with the police department is a really big thing because if you saw that recent study that came out, 70% of officers that get fired by the chief get reinstated due to the union contract, highest in America. I've had this discussion with many people and say, look, it's contractual. We have to deal with that from
Right.
a contract side. From a community side, what do you think the community's role is? Is that a voting thing? Do you think we should reach out to the police department? Is there a way to involve the community in the police union to the extent that maybe they don't ask for so much whenever they know it's harmful to a community?
I think now is the moment in which that can happen.
Yeah.
I mean, the community exerts a lot of power, in a sense, through their vote. And in this city, we don't vote, which is a problem. Yeah. And so if the community is saying we need to do this, but the community doesn't vote, and I'm not saying which side a person has to vote, but the fact that if you vote and people know you vote, they're going to be more accountable to you.
Right.
And I do think that tough questions need to be asked about the union and why do you feel that this lack of accountability, in a sense, is necessary in this light.
Right.
And how do we find a way to come together in good faith?
And it seems like some simple tweaks. I think I was reading that if there was just an independent arbitrator that was chosen, that would fix a lot of it. But it sounds like the union gets to pick their own arbitrators, and that's problematic.
When the new contract comes around, those questions have to be asked.
Right.
And the community has to push hard on specific issues. I don't think that the push on defunding is going to work, but I do think that you should ask for these other things. I think there's some type of a committee that works, that should have some oversight. I don't know if it really works, but there has to be oversight. There has to be accountability, and these things have to be baked into that contract. And it should be expressed to them that this is good for them because it will make their job easy.
Right.
I think I would want to be accountable. As a professor, I want to be held accountable. I want to do my job. And I know that most cops probably do too.
I agree.
Teachers, my wife gets, she's held accountable. She's assessed, and if she doesn't meet the standard, then you are given things that you're expected to meet before, and if you can't, then eventually you will lose your position.
On the flip side of that, I think teachers like your wife are not protected enough our state, unlike a union contract for the police, which last I remember, it was maybe illegal for teachers to unionize in the state of Texas. So, kind of a flip-flop. Yeah. Teachers are held to a very high standard.
We hold pilots to a high standard.
Yeah.
I mean, if a pilot has wrecked 5 times or 16 times, I don't think that they're going to be allowed to get behind we have these kinds of background checks. I mean,
I would hope if they wreck once an airplane that they're out of the
when
game.
I see when a cop has a regular routine check, I want to be able to have faith that I know that cop has been held accountable.
Yeah.
I admit I tend to give them the benefit of the doubt. But as an African-American man, there's always this place in the back of my mind. And I would think that the union would try to recognize that and see, we can come here and we can work together on this because it will make their job easier because I'm not necessarily thinking of, do I have to run or will they shoot me in the back? So I think that those are the kinds of questions that can be raised that kind of puts the onus on them to explain why this is not necessary.
Because one video like that in a city makes policing harder.
Exactly.
For all the policemen.
Exactly.
Let's talk about San Antonio. You're very well known as a man of faith. You're involved in the faith community on the east side. Mm-hmm. Mount Zion, I believe, is a church you attend. Has there been any coalescing of the faith communities on the multiple different faith communities on the east side to come together and try to create some sort of clear messaging or provide support or any sort of involvement where there's some coming together of the faith communities?
The Baptist Ministers Union has always been involved in these issues. The Council of Churches for Social Action is another organization that's working. And so there are organizations, I know that they work closely with the NAACP and others. They had there was a meeting, I think last week with the NAACP, the district attorney, Joe Gonzalez, is that?
Yeah.
Joe Gonzalez. Javier Salazar is coming into black churches a lot of times. And so there is a lot of work that the black church is doing. I think that as we move forward, I would expect to see more of that because I think that that's an apparatus along with NAACP that is able to express a very clear message that can start talking about specific issues that just go beyond the more defund the police. I think
Sure.
there are issues that the NAACP and probably the Baptist Ministers Union and others, I think you'll start to see it there. Because right now, I think it's such a very saturated time period. But I think that really quickly we're going to start to see that, basically you're not going to be marching every day.
Right.
How long is that going to continue? Now we have to come up with agenda items. And I think that that's when you're going to start to see a much more centered thought of how do we harness what's happened and go for things that are actually achievable.
Do you think this will be limited to policing reform, or do you think that this opportunity will lead to a broader reform in terms of racial injustice?
I would like to see it lead to a broader reform, but if it's just police reform, that's progress.
It's a victory.
That's huge progress. These are issues. If you look at the formation of the Black Panther Party, policing was at the forefront of the formation of the Black Panther Party. So this issue of policing has not been something that just arrived. My introduction to it was Rodney King.
Right.
I
Mine
remember
too.
that gravelly video. It seems so gravelly now compared to the videos so clear now.
Have you watched LA 92, the Netflix documentary on right now?
I did not.
We'll go back and watch it. It sort of takes you through all of it again. And
it's, I knew what happened.
Yeah.
I saw the billy clubs, and I saw how unjust it was, and I saw that, and I recognized that could be me. But everybody who's older African American was talking about the same things. I talked to people in this city, they were talking about things like that happening here. So if that is the only thing that comes out of it, then that is progress. But I also think that we have to look at the income gap. We have to look at the ways that African Americans, the implicit bias kinds of things. Mm-hmm. It's not fair that if you have a certain name that you're less likely to get a job.
Yeah.
It's not fair, or it's not right when somebody looks at you and they call the cops saying that you're threatening them like the person in Central Park. You're saying, put a leash on your dog, I'm scared. Well, then that's contributing. So if you do that, then what happens if the cops come there and they're told that, well, this person is scaring me?
Yeah. If he wasn't videotaping her, he probably would have got arrested.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so those are the things, there is a policy aspect that can happen, but there also needs to be a personal accountability role that all of us must take. And that's, we've passed, as a lawyer, we've passed hundreds of thousands of laws that dealt with race.
Right.
And that hasn't changed a person's heart. This is the first time I think that I believe that people's hearts have been opened, and maybe this is my religious leanings too, but people's hearts have been open to having difficult conversations on race. There are people asking questions that I never thought would ask.
Right.
And with George Floyd, let's take a look at Rodney King to Trayvon Martin to George Floyd and ask, what are the differences? With Rodney King, I didn't hear people saying that could be me.
Sure.
Outside of the real African-American community. There may have been some, but I don't feel a large groundswell of people saying that could be me.
Well, it seemed like
I identify with this person.
It also seemed like that Rodney King, there was kind of already all of the rap and the music and the stories about LAPD and cops that were crazy anyway. So
and
people kind of had that.
About Rodney King came out too, and so there were some people who said, "Well, maybe he did something."
I remember my next door neighbor who was a police officer. I was a kid, and I remember saying something like, "That's me." Whatever a kid says, that makes you scared as a kid. That's bad as a kid. And I remember him saying something along the lines of, he deserved it because he had cocaine in his system, something like that. And it was just, he was a police officer and he was a nice man, and there was no thought in his head that was inappropriate. Mm-hmm.
Even with Trayvon Martin, there wasn't that kind of a connection, I think. But for some reason, in this moment, there seems to be a connection of where you've got people on the far left and the far right, from Pat Robertson to the far left, saying that what happened here was unjust.
Greg Abbott even.
And Greg Abbott yesterday, I believe, or the day before. And then on top of that, you have not just them saying that it was wrong, but that we have to find a way to heal what has happened. And so even left and right, and I'm going to particularly talk about right, they're talking about something needs to happen, that it just wasn't. And I think it's interesting that they're not just saying this was just a rogue cop. That's the difference. I mean,
that was the first talking point, to be fair.
Easy to just say that, exactly, but now it's changed.
It has.
People say, well, that's just one rogue cop. This
Bad
was
apple
a rogue,
was the first thing.
And he knew him, or they had some relationship, they worked together, rogue.
Yeah.
We can't look at this and say anything more. But now people are saying, there's something.
I think it's getting drowned out is what I think it is, because when this first happened, I looked at Lindsay and I said, okay, they're going to say, well, he was arrested in 1997 for this. And that's the story. He was a bad guy. He deserved it. And I asked Brian, who you met, who's a black gentleman, I said, well, why is this any different than all the others? Why is this a different experience? And he told me, he said it was the look on his face. He said the guy was killing a man, looking into a camera with complete indifference. And I mean, really think about it.
For a long period of time. But then Rodney King was a long period of time too.
True.
But time has changed.
Yeah.
We have a younger group of people who grew up with black people, who see black people as their friends, who hung out with them. It's not, George Floyd is not just some black man.
Right.
George Floyd could be your best friend. He could be your boyfriend. He could be your uncle. He could be somebody, of the person that you work with. And I think that that's how America has shifted a little bit, is that even though we're still segregated, we have, especially our younger people, wide range of friends.
Right.
And there's a lot of communication happening. And so when that happens, I think they're saying, this is some serious mess. I mean,
we also have bystanders who have no skin in the game, who are completely innocent, telling them, let the guy breathe. I mean, you have outside perspectives who have no reason to be in trouble with the police, who are completely innocent, informing the police what they were doing is wrong, and they just don't care. I mean, this thing had kind of the perfect coming together of a lot of things. And the biggest thing, I think, was, like you said, time. Yeah. It was a long time where this guy is completely...
think of the privilege to be just, and I don't use the term privilege a lot, but you're sitting on a guy's neck. People are around you taking videos of you, and you're just still doing.
Right.
That's power.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think of...
That's power. It's so much power that bystanders like myself would be worried they would be shot if they tried to help the man. Exactly. And that's a scary amount of power for the police to have.
And I think America is asking, is this what we want America to be?
Right.
Do you expect... I mean, we say that, we talk about the Constitution. We talk about the Declaration of Independence. And we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Bam. I mean, it didn't look that equal when no one felt that they had the ability to say stop.
The minute that guy was handcuffed, y'all's job on top of him is done.
Exactly.
At that point, he goes in the back of your car. If you've got a reason to arrest him, I mean, that there's just, and legally there are so many things that kick in the minute they handcuff him, and they just ignore all of that. All those things they had been taught their whole career for what? Forgery?
And the people wanted to stop it.
Yeah.
But they had been so, what do you do? And I think that maybe that's why people are marching now, is because the people who were there that were videoing, that was all that they could do, that they had been so browbeaten in a sense and convinced that you don't do anything or else that's you. It's
an odd amount of power.
I mean,
judge, jury, and executioner.
When we start to look at what happens in countries that we see as developing and the police systems that emerge in those countries, that's what we expect there.
Right.
We don't, I think for a large percentage of Americans, they don't see that as America. I think for a certain segment, they understand.
Yeah, and let's talk about that. I mean, I think that's a really good point, because I have a friend here who I think is a wonderful human being with a wonderful heart. And I had to, him and I have this long discussion about, well, that doesn't happen in San Antonio. I said, okay, well, just take any black friend of yours and ask them how many times you get pulled over by the cops in any given year. And I asked Brian, and he said 4 times in a normal year. I haven't been pulled over 4 times in my life. I mean, the experience is just entirely different. What And I kind of want to talk more about San Antonio now. What do you think San Antonio's focus should be to, one, make sure that this doesn't happen here, and two, create an environment to where my friend who has the world's biggest heart has more empathy and understanding for what somebody else is going through who happens to be a different skin color? Because I can tell them all I want, but unless they have a friend going through it or unless they've seen it, they don't understand it.
I think for San Antonio, a couple of things that we have that I think as a city it would be good for us to kind of move out of kind of a cocoon. I think we believe that bad things happen outside of San Antonio, that San Antonio is this kind of oasis in which we don't have race problems. That's untrue.
Right.
There's this feeling that San Antonio didn't have racism and discrimination as much as other places. It may not have been like Birmingham, but historically, if you go, there are instances of where police killed young black men. But even historically, as you look up, there were segregation laws in San Antonio. There was a swimming pool law that was passed Juneteenth, I believe, 1954. City Council actually passed a segregation law on Juneteenth, June 19th, which is the day we celebrate emancipation. City Council passed a segregation law. Now, they rescinded it a year later, but it was still passed.
Sure.
The Majestic Theater was segregated. So there's a long legacy of
Courthouses
segregation here. We have, redlining in the 1930s really divided the city north, south, east, and west. And then you have restrictive covenants that basically banned African Americans or others from coming into those areas. And so the reason that we have the city that we have is because of the legacy of discrimination. And it wasn't just against blacks, it was against Latinos as well. And then as we look at that, we also have to recognize that African Americans are about 8 to 10% of the population, somewhere around there.
Right.
And a large part of that is military. But I think sometimes that plight gets kind of drowned out, which I don't think is right. I mean, I think that we should pay more attention to that and not just say that we all get along in San Antonio. I think that if you talk to African Americans, they're not saying that.
Right.
But there's a perception in the city that that's the reality. If you look at where African Americans are living, it's a kind of a microcosm of America and the kinds of economic progress that we've had. Is it better here than in other areas? I don't think so. And so I say there's this image of San Antonio that we kind of need to unpack to see the real San Antonio.
Right.
There are not a lot of black professors in San Antonio. If you look at the black professional numbers, they're not that high. And really, if you look at San Antonio up to Austin, a lot of African Americans will say that whole, as we talk about that corridor being the corridor of great growth, it's not a corridor that's bringing in a lot of African Americans from outside. So you might start to see over time a percentage drop of African Americans. In Austin, it's already happening by percentage of people not moving who are African American into those areas. And so we say that this is an area that's developing business-wise. We're creating all these businesses. The question is, are these businesses that are actively looking towards hiring African Americans, or is this a city that African Americans are actively looking to move to? I think there are questions on both ends.
Yeah.
I think there's a perception, but it's not a perception that African Americans have offered. It's a perception that's kind of offered it on top of African Americans.
And is the answer to sort of incorporate all communities together? I mean, look, everybody knows the East Side is sort of the largest population of African Americans in San Antonio. Does that create a scenario in which people just kind of ignore the plight because they are in their own area and they have their own issues and their own problems? Would it be alleviated by making sure that opportunities were there for everybody to live amongst one another?
I think you could look at it both ways. I think on one, the reason that we have the council district system the way that we have is because of, and we should create District 2 and all of those was, I guess in the late 70s, a way of trying to give equal representation or trying to find a way for blacks on the East Side and others to have representation where you have kind of district voting in people versus a citywide.
Yeah.
I wonder, and I'm just thinking now, is that the kind of city we still want. And I'm not saying that it is. I'm not saying that it isn't. But I think that we might want to take a look at our city. I guess it's the charter that we have, or however we elect districts, however we elect councilmen. Because African Americans are not just living on the east side. I'm not even sure that's a majority district anymore. They're living all around in the north side, the northeast side. You see a lot of African Americans on those sides.
Yeah.
And I think that in some senses there's this image of the black power structure still coming out of the east side. And I think that there's a large number of African Americans who don't have that access that are on other sides of the city that have contributions as well. Now, that didn't quite answer the question that you were
that's fair,
asking, but I would also think that in looking at the kinds of jobs we're still a service sector city. I think if we're going to move forward, we're going to have to be a city that will attract. The Pearl is not necessarily the most place that's going to attract a large African American population.
I agree.
And I think that as we promote those things, and we should, there has to. I think there's maybe a tone deaf that may not attract certain segments of our community, perhaps Latino and African American and Asian, perhaps.
Right.
I think we need to be much more specific in our outreach and the kinds of people that we're looking. We want all to come here. I don't know if we make that a convincing case in the way that we promote the city.
As we move forward sort of through this, I'm going to call it an opportunity to address some racial issues. Where can people look? So either for guidance or what's going on in terms of our own city. So there doesn't seem to be a strong voice that has come out in this sort of discussion as it relates to San Antonio. Am I missing that? Is there one? Is there a group that has sort of been tapped by the city to create these conversations and help, or are we still kind of swimming upstream a little bit?
I think we're swimming,
okay.
And I think that's a large part because of COVID.
Yeah.
I think people's lives have been torn apart.
Sure.
I mean, the unemployment rate is horrible right now, and for African Americans, all of the progress, if we want to say that, it might take black wealth with COVID down to zero on average. And so because of that, I think how do you organize when you can't meet, when you're still socially distancing? And so I think as we start to come out of this, I think groups like the NAACP, I'm going to specifically say them, but I'm also going to say the Black Ministers Union, I think you're going to start to see them have a larger role. But I think it's very difficult for them, as it is for anybody. And COVID has run roughshod over the African American community. I mean, we're twice as likely, in a sense, to catch this. I was scared. That's one of the reasons why it took some time for us to get together. And I think that when people are under those conditions, it's hard to start to think long term, because how do you build the apparatus to do so? But
kind of the protests are making it to where we have to consider it. They're loud enough we can't ignore it until the sickness is done.
And I think the question is what happens after. You cannot protest forever.
Right.
And at some point we're going to have to sit down. And I'm not devaluing the protest at all. They have the protest, which is different from a riot and the other kinds of things. The protests, I think, have created really important conversations that we're now taking in. But now is the time to sit at the table and start thinking policy initiatives, but also think heart initiatives. I don't think that policy and just the vote gets us out of the heart.
Yeah.
Because there's a reason. You can have every law against the cop, and he still could kill George Floyd.
Yeah.
It's what changes a person's heart, and it's that empathy. And I talked about this a week ago. Studies show that Americans have less empathy for other people over the last 40 years, that the ability for us to consider somebody else has dropped. Now, that's not good when you say that 40 years ago we were, or 40 or 50 or 60 years, we were segregated. But maybe because of cell phones, maybe we've lost that human touch. And so maybe that's why the cop could stand over George Floyd and just choke the hell out of him and just look at a camera. He doesn't care one iota that that's a human being. In the way that we talk about our politics, we have Republicans and Democrats just absolutely hating each other.
Right.
I hate, people say, I hate Republicans. I hate Democrats. I can't date a Republican. I can't date a Democrat. I don't want to be around them. I'm going to defriend them on Facebook. We have had a generation of defriending, lack of conversation across boundaries, and it's created, I think, a mentality of not being able to empathize with others and to work with others. And so voting is important. Go out and vote. Changing the police contract, got to do that. Making sure there's some type of accountability, that has to happen. We need to work with the income gap. But you can't do any of that unless if you have empathy.
And you wouldn't want to unless you felt empathetic. Yeah.
How do we deal with the income gap if people aren't open to hiring people of different backgrounds for jobs and looking beyond a person's name?
Right.
Or looking at standards and saying, maybe these standards aren't exactly fair, or maybe I'm undervaluing a person's contribution to this job because they're working on things that I'm not giving them credit for working on.
Right.
That's where the heart comes in. And I think that, we think about Martin Luther King and other black leaders of the past, and all the great leaders, they didn't just talk about laws. Martin Luther King and Gandhi and all, they all talked about a beloved community. Well, that's a legal aspect, it's a political aspect, but it's also a social aspect. A law can't change a person's heart. That comes from the person, that comes from the environment. And that's what I think we have a chance with here, is that it seems that people empathize with George Floyd.
I think that's exactly right.
In a different kind of way that many did not empathize with Trayvon Martin or Emmett Till or Ahmaud Arbery.
Yeah.
And that, of all of the things that's happened, has been the thing that stunned me. Because, people say, well, what did you think when you saw? I didn't think anything. I mean, when I say I didn't think anything, it's not like I haven't seen a video showing a black man get killed or beat up. But that's where others have changed, I think, how we look at this.
I hope so, because after Sandy Hook, I thought that was going to change the discussion on guns, and it didn't change anything. And I was very I'm not saying I'm for this or for that, but it should have changed the conversation, and it didn't. And I hope that this opportunity isn't wasted by poor leadership, and I'm not even going to call it leadership, by loud voices getting in the way of the movement, because I think some of them are just people who have a platform and they're going to make it about them. And I also hope it does not get lost in the people that say, give me an inch, I'm going to take a mile, who now say we want to get rid of police departments entirely. I mean, that's not productive either. So that's my concern on this opportunity, and I hope some leaders step up within this opportunity. And, we were talking before you got here, I was talking with Brian before you got here about how some of the big voices, African-American voices in elected politics, are noticeably absent in this. I mean, Kamala's kind of noticed. Tim Scott kind of absent in these discussions where their voices probably are needed at this moment, and I think that's an unfortunate, I don't even know why that's happening, but I think it's unfortunate that it is happening in this moment.
I think so. And I think moments don't last forever. You only have a small opportunity to seize a time period.
Right.
That's what history tells us. And if you go beyond that time period, the opportunity's gone.
Right.
This is an opportunity, but we now have to step back and look at it and evaluate it and see what can actually be done and what can bring a consensus together.
Right.
It's got to be a consensus. I think there's an opportunity to bring many cops along the way on this issue.
Oh, I agree.
I believe it. I believe there's a way of getting, Greg Abbott and others on board to something. We're all agreeing with that. Let's see what we can get. Let's not do what we did with healthcare in the early 90s when we said, if I don't get everything I want, it's all gone.
Yeah.
That's not healthy. We've got to help the people that we can help now. And then we can work.
And the income gap, addressing that addresses people from all walks of life.
Exactly.
That is not
just
it's an African-American thing. Yeah, it's everybody.
This city, we are one of the most unequal cities in this nation. And it's because of policies.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for it. Recognizing it and being intentional. And I know our mayor is, and I know he has his equity program.
Yeah.
But all Americans should want a better America for all Americans.
And COVID's highlighting that as well. I mean, there's a strange confluence of events right now that if we don't capitalize on it right now, when will we? I mean, everything's accentuated, everything's highlighted. People can't live off $600 a month unemployment, and that's what they're expected to do right now.
You know, when you think about, the drug wars should have shown us that you cannot dismiss a community and it not to spread to other communities.
Right.
There was this feeling in the 80s that that's just what's happening in poor black and brown communities, but primarily black communities. It didn't just stay there.
Same with HIV.
Now we have an opioid situation where it's interesting of how our empathy has shifted from what happened during the crack years. Mm-hmm. But why do we only have empathy for people that look like us? We're all connected. That's why I often talk about my ancestry, and it's the ancestry of every American.
Right.
We're all mixed. And there are many people who claim to be white but got black ancestors that they don't know about it because black people crossed over so many times. Why can't we see ourselves as one body and one people that have different experiences that make us stronger? Because what affects me affects you. I may be more likely to catch COVID, but if I cough on you, you're going to get it.
Yeah.
I mean, so to think that we may not be empathetic or have compassion for somebody because they look different or we think that they're different, that's ridiculous.
I agree with you.
And the COVID thing, I knew it was going to, issues of diabetes, issues of high blood pressure,
hypertension, obesity.
These are issues that are tied to class, socioeconomic status. It's tied to the lack of groceries in certain neighborhoods. It's tied to stress. I sometimes, people say, well, why aren't you always talking about the issues? That's stressful to constantly be talking about George Floyd every day.
Mm-hmm.
That's the burden that the African American often is held accountable for. But the amount of stress that comes because of that has a contribution to a person's health. So race and racism has a negative effect on a person's health because stress can cause hypertension.
Yeah.
Stress can cause you to be obese. Stress can cause, I suspect, diabetes. So all of that is the implicit or the
structural,
the consequences of structural racism, and it's the consequences of the America that we created. Do you think it's not stressful for a person to be surrounded as a cop beats a person that looks up at you and you can't do anything?
Everybody was traumatized.
Yeah. I think about Emmett Till's mother. Her son, horrifically beaten. She opens a casket.
It's on the page of the newspaper, wasn't it?
But the pain, yeah. But the pain that mother had to experience to, in a sense, sacrifice her own son. And people say, well, you did a good job. But I think about her heart and the consequences of that must have been to her heart. That's why we should ask that. That's why it's better for us. And then if I go to a doctor, and I do, but there's a likelihood that many doctors don't think that African Americans feel pain the same kind of way.
Is that true?
Yes, that they can take it better. That's one of the reasons that we have the opioid environment. It's not because some doctors have been found to be more likely to prescribe opioids to other people because of the feeling of that blacks have this innate ability to handle pain. Well, there was this thought that blacks didn't catch certain diseases back during slavery.
When COVID started, they discussed how nobody in Africa had it, and therefore they had some sort of secret sauce or the hydroxychloroquine because of malaria. I mean,
now African Americans do have some they do have some protection against malaria because of the sickle cell trait or disease, which gives you some protection. But that's a whole different thing. And sickle cell is pain for the people that have to struggle through that. My mother had sickle cell, and it eventually she died because of it.
Yeah.
But these are things that are in the African American community that have existed. And as a nation, I don't think we've come together to say, let's take this load off a little bit. It's on all of us.
Yeah.
We've contributed a lot. I think it's now all of our responsibility to lessen that a little bit.
I think San Antonio is the type of city that wants to know how to get better, and I hope we figure out a way to have these conversations because I think people genuinely want to make the city better, which is different than some cities, I think. You're now officially my longest episode ever, but I've really enjoyed this. I don't want to end this just yet because there was an article in the paper I looked at. I want to end with you just giving me a little bit of an idea. There's a plan at some point to create an African-American institute to sort of discuss San Antonio, to highlight some of its history. It sounds like to even be a location for lectures and discussions. What is sort of the planned goal or hope in the future with what y'all can do?
We hope that we can create a center that would be able to present African-American history and the kind of history that people don't know about all the time. And the people that people don't know about. We think of, one of the things that we have with African-American history is we think of the great people, but there's a larger apparatus that underpins that. And so we want to provide some focus for that. But we also want to talk about things in that maybe through public art and other ways that African-Americans have contributed and to kind of show that to the city. And so the center is not just a space, but it's also an outside space for people to be able to see how the buildings were integrated and how the lunch counters were integrated in San Antonio, or should I say desegregated, and how schools were desegregated. And so there's a broader story that I would hope that this institute would show, but also allowing for internships and other kinds of things that students and others can have a way of actually being active in not just the past, but also creating that better future, working with the city and working with other people. So the center is a broad idea. But yes, showing history, showing it in artwork, having a space that can host events, but also creating a space where we can actually do some work that makes these things better. Maybe we can have a kind of apparatus that will allow for the cops to come to us or the union come to us and talk about these things.
And is the plan to have that somewhere downtown?
Yes.
Okay. I think we talked, there's sort of some unknowns for everything right now.
There's a lot of unknowns right now, so that's why I'm a little vague.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
But the plan is, it's needed in the city, but I hope and I would expect that this can be done in a way that contributes something to the city. And just like everything else, I think the idea that I have for it is a positive center. We can't always be just negative about our history.
Mm-hmm.
We have to approach it as far as what can we accomplish. It's the same thing that I feel about the protests right now. Let's take the positive from this. George Floyd was not a positive event.
Right.
But let's find a way to actually make something work for the benefit of people and to not just snatch defeat out of victory.
Yeah.
By trying to blow up everything in a sense. Let's find, and so the center is going to be about a place of creating solutions and finding and placing people in the environment where they can do that and to not just talk about the problems, but to act on them.
I think it's great because I've heard, and then I've heard people be corrected, discuss San Antonio in terms of we never had that sordid history that a lot of cities had. And you'll hear some people say it, and you'll hear some people say it and then get corrected by somebody else. And really, there's not a lot of great information out there on sort of our history as it relates to race relations in San Antonio. So I think it'd be a great addition to the city.
But at the same time, San Antonio's not going to be like Richmond, Virginia, or Birmingham.
Right.
8 to 10% is not going to give you. It gives a distorted view of what they're facing because you don't see them every day. And also maybe African Americans weren't seen as the same kind of a threat as they were in Birmingham or Richmond or Winston-Salem or Greensboro or places like that. At the same time, we have a military population. And one of the things that does temper the racial climate, at least on the surface, is you have the military. And military establishments provided really the first space where African Americans could have really good professional jobs because, a number of executive orders forced those establishments that be racist in the way that they gave jobs.
Right.
And so to keep government funding coming in, those bases had to be not racial in the way, or at least saying that they were. And it provided an environment where you had some progress, but under that surface was this layer that existed throughout the South and America. Racism is not just a Southern problem.
Right.
You have it out west. You've got it in the southwest. You've got it in the north. Boston certainly is not a racially liberal environment. You know, busing was not an issue in the south as it was in the north. And so we cannot look at San Antonio and just say because we don't see hoses and dogs biting people that it doesn't exist. You don't have to have those things to have race problems.
Right.
And those things didn't happen everywhere, even in the South. You can't use that as a comparison to say we don't have problems.
No, I think that's why it'd be great to have.
Yeah, the economics are still there.
Right.
And the living experiences are still there. And when you talk to the older African Americans, talking to them off the record, there were some things here that happened that were just horrific. But even they don't want to say that openly. Will
those oral histories be preserved in the
yes.
in the center
so
if it gets up and going?
I've already started to do a number of oral histories, in which will be available to the public.
Are you recording them or writing them? All right,
recording.
Great.
One of the things about recording is that you can get the feel of people's pain.
Yeah.
In the way that they talk, and you can feel it. When you write it, you can't feel how a person is saying it, and also sometimes when you listen to a person and you see a person, you can kind of figure out where they're going and what they're not giving you.
Yeah.
You follow them because they give you little hints. San Antonio never had any problems.
Where do you plan to publish those at?
They'll be at Trinity.
Okay. All right.
Got to get them through Trinity.
All right.
In time when I put them all together.
Yeah. Will you come back on if and when this institute gets up and running?
Of course.
Maybe we could we could actually bring this equipment and do an episode there.
Absolutely.
It would be awesome, actually.
It would be an honor.
All right. So first of all, let me thank you for being the longest running guest, and thank you for coming during all this.
Maybe the most talkative guest. Is that what it is? I talk more
I don't think so. But I mean, the intent was not to have you come on and talk about George Floyd. The time's here. Right. Thank you for doing that. Our city has a lot of issues to deal with, but we also do well in terms of motivation, which I think is the important part. We want to be better. So that's going to
agree with that.
Good. And you have a totally different perspective, so I'm glad you do agree with, and I'm not completely tone deaf. So I think it's important I'm not tone deaf, honestly. That's going to do it for this episode. Dr. Latimore, thank you so much for being here. This will be up next week for you, for all of our listeners. It'll be up the day you're listening to it. Our guest wish list continues. Patty Mills, Shea Serrano, Coach Pop. We'd love to have any of y'all on, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Alamo Hour. You are all what make this city so great. We hope you join us next week. In the meantime, subscribe to our podcast. Check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/Alamo Hour or our website, alamohour.com. Until next time, Viva San Antonio!